Chapter 59, Part 1 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6, by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 59, The Crusades, Part 1. In a style less grave than that of history, I should perhaps compare the Emperor Alexius to the jackal, who is said to follow the steps and to devour the leavings of the lion. Whatever had been his fears and toils in the passage of the First Crusade, they were amply recompensed by the subsequent benefits which he derived from the exploits of the Franks. His dexterity and vigilance secured their first conquest of Nice, and from this threatening station the Turks were compelled to evacuate the neighbourhood of Constantinople. While the Crusaders, with blind valour, advanced into the midland countries of Asia, the crafty Greek improved the favourable occasion when the emirs of the sea-coast were recalled to the standard of the Sultan. The Turks were driven from the Isles of Rhodes and Chios. The cities of Ephesus and Smyrna, of Sardes, Philadelphia and Laodicea were restored to the empire, which Alexius enlarged from the Hellespont to the banks of the Meander and the rocky shores of Pamphylia. The churches resumed their splendour, the towns were rebuilt and fortified, and the desert country was peopled with colonies of Christians, who were gently removed from the more distant and dangerous frontier. In these paternal cares we may forgive Alexius if he forgot the deliverance of the Holy Sepulchre. But, by the Latins, he was stigmatized with the foul reproach of treason and desertion. They had sworn fidelity and obedience to his throne, but he had promised to assist their enterprise in person, or at least with his troops and treasures. His base retreat dissolved their obligations, and the sword, which had been the instrument of their victory, was the pledge and title of their just independence. It does not appear that the emperor attempted to revive his obsolete claims over the kingdom of Jerusalem, but the borders of Sicilia and Syria were more recent in his possession and more accessible to his arms. The great army of the Crusaders was annihilated or dispersed. The principality of Antioch was left without a head by the surprise and captivity of Bohemond. His ransom had oppressed him with a heavy debt, and his Norman followers were insufficient to repel the hostilities of the Greeks and Turks. In this distress Bohemond embraced a magnanimous resolution of leaving the defence of Antioch to his kinsman, the faithful Tancred, of arming the West against the Byzantine Empire, and of executing the design which he inherited from the lessons and example of his father Guiscard. His embarkation was clandestine, and if we may credit a tale of the Princess Anne, he passed the hostile sea closely secreted in a coffin. But his reception in France was dignified by the public applause, and his marriage with the king's daughter. His return was glorious, since the bravest spirits of the age enlisted under his veteran command, and he repassed the Adriatic at the head of 5,000 horse and 40,000 foot, assembled from the most remote climates of Europe. The strength of Durazzo and prudence of Alexius, the progress of famine and approach of winter, eluded his ambitious hopes, and the venal confederates were seduced from his standard. A treaty of peace suspended the fears of the Greeks, and they were finally delivered by the death of an adversary whom neither oaths could bind, nor dangers could appall, nor prosperity could satiate. His children succeeded to the principality of Antioch, but the boundaries were strictly defined, the homage was clearly stipulated, and the cities of Tarsus and Malmistra were restored to the Byzantine emperors. Of the coast of Anatolia they possessed the entire circuit from Trebizond to the Syrian gates. The Seljukian dynasty of Roum was separated on all sides from the sea and their Mussulman brethren. The power of the Sultan was shaken by the victories, and even the defeats of the Franks. And, after the loss of Nice, they removed their throne to Cogni or Iconium, an obscure and inland town above 300 miles from Constantinople. Instead of trembling for their capital, the Comnenian princes waged an offensive war against the Turks, and the First Crusade prevented the fall of the declining empire. In the 12th century, 3 great emigrations marched by land from the west for the relief of Palestine. The soldiers and pilgrims of Lombardy, France, and Germany were excited by the example and success of the First Crusade. 48 years after the deliverance of the Holy Sepulchre, the Emperor and the French King, Conrad III and Louis VII, undertook the Second Crusade to support the falling fortunes of the Latins. A grand division of the Third Crusade was led by the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who sympathized with his brothers of France and England in the common loss of Jerusalem. These 3 expeditions may be compared in their resemblance of the greatness of numbers, their passage through the Greek Empire, and the nature and event of their Turkish warfare, and a brief parallel may save the repetition of a tedious narrative. However splendid it may seem, a regular story of the Crusades would exhibit the perpetual return of the same causes and effects, and the frequent attempts for the defence or recovery of the Holy Land would appear so many faint and unsuccessful copies of the original. End of Chapter 59, Part 1. Chapter 59, Part 2 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6 by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 59, The Crusades, Part 2. By the arms of the Turks and Franks, the Fatimites had been deprived of Syria. In Egypt, the decay of their character and influence was still more essential. Yet they were still revered as the descendants and successors of the Prophet. They maintained their invisible state in the palace of Cairo, and their person was seldom violated by the profane eyes of subjects or strangers. The Latin ambassadors have described their own introduction through a series of gloomy passages and glittering porticos. The scene was enlivened by the warbling of birds and the murmur of fountains. It was enriched by a display of rich furniture and rare animals. Of the imperial treasures something was shown, and much was supposed. And the long order of unfolding doors was guarded by black soldiers and domestic eunuchs. The sanctuary of the presence chamber was veiled with a curtain, and the vizier, who conducted the ambassadors, laid aside the scimitar and prostrated himself 3 times on the ground. The veil was then removed, and they beheld the commander of the faithful, who signified his pleasure to the first slave of the throne. But this slave was his master. The viziers or sultans had usurped the supreme administration of Egypt. The claims of the rival candidates were decided by arms, and the name of the most worthy, of the strongest, was inserted in the royal patent of command. The factions of Dargham and Shawa alternately expelled each other from the capital and country, and the weaker side implored the dangerous protection of the Sultan of Damascus or the King of Jerusalem, the perpetual enemies of the sect and monarchy of the Fatimites. By his arms and religion the Turk was most formidable, but the Frank, in an easy direct march, could advance from Gaza to the Nile, while the intermediate situation of his realm compelled the troops of Noureddin to wheel round the skirts of Arabia, a long and painful circuit which exposed them to thirst, fatigue, and the burning winds of the desert. The secret zeal and ambition of the Turkish prince aspired to reign in Egypt under the name of the Abbassides, but the restoration of the suppliant Shawa was the ostensible motive of the first expedition, and the success was entrusted to the Emir Shirkuh, a valiant and veteran commander. Dargham was oppressed and slain, but the ingratitude, the jealousy, the just apprehensions of his more fortunate rival soon provoked him to invite the King of Jerusalem to deliver Egypt from his insolent benefactors. To this union the forces of Shirkuh were unequal. He relinquished the premature conquest, and the evacuation of Belbase or Pelusium was the condition of his safe retreat. As the Turks defiled before the enemy, and their general closed the rear with a vigilant eye and a battle-axe in his hand, a Frank presumed to ask him if he were not afraid of an attack. "It is doubtless in your power to begin the attack," replied the intrepid emir, "but rest assured that not one of my soldiers will go to paradise till he has sent an infidel to hell." His report of the riches of the land, the effeminacy of the natives, and the disorders of the government, revived the hopes of Noureddin. The Caliph of Bagdad applauded the pious design, and Shirkuh descended into Egypt a second time with 12,000 Turks and 11,000 Arabs. Yet his forces were still inferior to the confederate armies of the Franks and Saracens, and I can discern an unusual degree of military art in his passage of the Nile, his retreat into Thebais, his masterly evolutions in the battle of Balbain, the surprise of Alexandria, and his marches and countermarches in the flats and valley of Egypt, from the tropic to the sea. His conduct was seconded by the courage of his troops, and on the eve of action a Mameluke exclaimed, "If we cannot wrest Egypt from the Christian dogs, why do we not renounce the honours and rewards of the Sultan, and retire to labour with the peasants, or to spin with the females of the harem?" Yet, after all his efforts in the field, after the obstinate defence of Alexandria by his nephew Saladin, an honourable capitulation and retreat concluded the second enterprise of Shirkuh, and Noureddin reserved his abilities for a third and more propitious occasion. It was soon offered by the ambition and avarice of Amalric or Amaury, king of Jerusalem, who had imbibed the pernicious maxim that no faith should be kept with the enemies of God. A religious warrior, the great master of the hospital, encouraged him to proceed. The Emperor of Constantinople either gave, or promised, a fleet to act with the armies of Syria, and the perfidious Christian, unsatisfied with spoil and subsidy, aspired to the conquest of Egypt. In this emergency the Moslems turned their eyes towards the Sultan of Damascus. The vizier, whom danger encompassed on all sides, yielded to their unanimous wishes, and Noureddin seemed to be tempted by the fair offer of 1/3 of the revenue of the kingdom. The Franks were already at the gates of Cairo, but the suburbs, the old city, were burnt on their approach. They were deceived by an insidious negotiation, and their vessels were unable to surmount the barriers of the Nile. They prudently declined a contest with the Turks in the midst of a hostile country, and Amaury retired into Palestine with the shame and reproach that always adhere to unsuccessful injustice. After this deliverance, Shirkuh was invested with a robe of honour, which he soon stained with the blood of the unfortunate Shaw. For a while the Turkish emirs condescended to hold the office of vizier, but this foreign conquest precipitated the fall of the Fatimites themselves, and the bloodless change was accomplished by a message and a word. The Caliphs had been degraded by their own weakness and the tyranny of the viziers. Their subjects blushed when the descendant and successor of the Prophet presented his naked hand to the rude grip of a Latin ambassador. They wept when he sent the hair of his women, a sad emblem of their grief and terror, to excite the pity of the Sultan of Damascus. By the command of Noureddin, and the sentence of the doctors, the holy names of Abu Bakr, Amar, and Othman were solemnly restored. The Caliph Mostadi of Bagdad was acknowledged in the public prayers as the true commander of the faithful, and the green livery of the sons of Ali was exchanged for the black colour of the Abbasides. The last of his race, the Caliph Adhed, who survived only 10 days, expired in happy ignorance of his fate. His treasures secured the loyalty of the soldiers and silenced the murmurs of the sectaries, and in all subsequent revolutions Egypt has never departed from the orthodox tradition of the Moslems. The hilly country beyond the Tigris is occupied by the pastoral tribes of the Kurds, a people hardy, strong, savage, impatient of the yoke, addicted to rapine, and tenacious of the government of their national chiefs. The resemblance of name, situation, and manners seems to identify them with the Carduchians of the Greeks, and they still defend against the Ottoman Porte the antique freedom which they asserted against the successors of Cyrus. Poverty and ambition prompted them to embrace the profession of mercenary soldiers. The service of his father and uncle prepared the reign of the great Saladin, and the son of Job, or Aoud, a simple Kurd, magnanimously smiled at his pedigree, which flattery deduced from the Arabian caliphs. So unconscious was Noureddin of the impending ruin of his house, that he constrained the reluctant youth to follow his uncle Shirkuh into Egypt. His military character was established by the defence of Alexandria, and, if we may believe the Latins, he solicited and obtained from the Christian general the profane honours of knighthood. On the death of Shirkuh, the office of Grand Vizier was bestowed on Saladin, as the youngest and least powerful of the emirs. But with the advice of his father, whom he invited to Cairo, his genius obtained the ascendant over his equals, and attached the army to his person and interest. While Noureddin lived, these ambitious Kurds were the most humble of his slaves, and the indiscreet murmurs of the Divan were silenced by the prudent Ayub, who loudly protested that at the command of the Sultan he himself would lead his sons in chains to the foot of the throne. Such language, he added in private, was prudent and proper in an assembly of your rivals, but we are now above fear and obedience, and the threats of Noureddin shall not extort the tribute of a sugar-cane. His seasonable death relieved them from the odious and doubtful conflict. His son, a minor of 11 years of age, was left for a while to the emirs of Damascus, and the new lord of Egypt was decorated by the caliph with every title that could sanctify his usurpation in the eyes of the people. Nor was Saladin long content with the possession of Egypt. He despoiled the Christians of Jerusalem and the Atabeks of Damascus, Aleppo, and Diyarbakir. Mecca and Medina acknowledged him for their temporal protector. His brother subdued the distant regions of Yemen or the happy Arabia, and at the hour of his death his empire was spread from the African Tripoli to the Tigris, and from the Indian Ocean to the mountains of Armenia. In the judgment of his character, the reproaches of treason and ingratitude strike forcibly on our minds, impressed as they are with the principle and experience of law and loyalty. But his ambition may in some measure be excused by the revolutions of Asia, which had erased every notion of legitimate succession, by the recent example of the Atabeks themselves, by his reverence to the son of his benefactor, his humane and generous behaviour to the collateral branches, by their incapacity and his merit, by the approbation of the Caliph, the sole source of all legitimate power, and, above all, by the wishes and interest of the people, whose happiness is the first object of government. In his virtues, and in those of his patron, they admired the singular union of the hero and the saint, for both Noureddin and Saladin are ranked among the Mohammedan saints, and the constant meditation of the holy war appears to have shed a serious and sober colour over their lives and actions. The youth of the latter was addicted to wine and women, but his aspiring spirit soon renounced the temptations of pleasure for the graver follies of fame and dominion. The garment of Saladin was of course woolen, water was his only drink, and while he emulated the temperance, he surpassed the chastity of his Arabian prophet. Both in faith and practice he was a rigid Mussulman. He ever deplored that the defensive religion had not allowed him to accomplish the pilgrimage of Mecca, but at the stated hours, 5 times each day, the Sultan devoutly prayed with his brethren. The involuntary omission of fasting was scrupulously repaid, and his perusal of the Koran, on horseback, between the approaching armies, may be quoted as a proof, however ostentatious, of piety and courage. The superstitious doctrine of the sect of Shafei was the only study that he deigned to encourage. The poets were safe in his contempt, but all profane science was the object of his aversion, and a philosopher who had invented some speculative novelties was seized and strangled by the command of the royal saint. The justice of his divan was accessible to the meanest suppliant against himself and his ministers, and it was only for a kingdom that Saladin would deviate from the rule of equity. While the descendants of Seljuk and Zengi held his stirrup and smoothed his garments, he was affable and patient with the meanest of his servants. So boundless was his liberality that he distributed 12,000 horses at the siege of Acre, and, at the time of his death, no more than 47 drams of silver and 1 piece of gold coin were found in the treasury. Yet, in a martial reign, the tributes were diminished, and the wealthy citizens enjoyed, without fear or danger, the fruits of their industry. Egypt, Syria, and Arabia were adorned by the royal foundations of hospitals, colleges, and mosques, and Cairo was fortified with a wall and citadel, but his works were consecrated to public use, nor did the Sultan indulge himself in a garden or palace of private luxury. In a fanatic age, himself a fanatic, the genuine virtues of Saladin commanded the esteem of the Christians. The Emperor of Germany gloried in his friendship, the Greek Emperor solicited his alliance, and the conquest of Jerusalem diffused and perhaps magnified his fame both in the East and West. During his short existence, the kingdom of Jerusalem was supported by the discord of the Turks and Saracens, and both the Fatimite caliphs and the sultans of Damascus were tempted to sacrifice the cause of their religion to the meaner considerations of private and present advantage. But the powers of Egypt, Syria, and Arabia were now united by a hero, whom nature and fortune had armed against the Christians. All without now bore the most threatening aspect, and all was feeble and hollow in the internal state of Jerusalem. After the first 2 Baldwins, the brother and cousin of Godfrey of Bouillon, the sceptre devolved by female succession to Melisenda, daughter of the 2nd Baldwin, and her husband Fulk, Count of Anjou, the father by a former marriage of our English Plantagenets. Their 2 sons, Baldwin III. And Ormary, waged a strenuous and not unsuccessful war against the infidels, but the son of Ormary, Baldwin IV., was deprived by the leprosy, a gift of the Crusades, of the faculties both of mind and body. His sister Sibylla, the mother of Baldwin V., was his natural heiress. After the suspicious death of her child, she crowned her 2nd husband, Guy of Lusignan, a prince of a handsome person, but of such base renown that his own brother Geoffrey was heard to exclaim, "Since they have made him a king, surely they would have made me a god." The choice was generally blamed, and the most powerful vassal, Raymond, Count of Tripoli, who had been excluded from the succession and regency, entertained an implacable hatred against the king, and exposed his honour and conscience to the temptations of the Sultan. Such were the guardians of the Holy City, a leper, a child, a woman, a coward, and a traitor, yet its fate was delayed 12 years by some supplies from Europe, by the valour of the military orders, and by the distant or domestic avocations of their great enemy. At length, on every side, the sinking state was encircled and pressed by a hostile line, and the truce was violated by the Franks, whose existence it protected. A soldier of fortune, Reginald of Chatillon, had seized a fortress on the edge of the desert, from whence he pillaged the caravans, insulted Mahomet, and threatened the cities of Mecca and Medina. Saladin condescended to complain, rejoiced in the denial of justice, and, at the head of 80,000 horse and foot, invaded the Holy Land. The choice of Tiberias for his first siege was suggested by the Count of Tripoli, to whom it belonged, and the King of Jerusalem was persuaded to drain his garrison and to arm his people for the relief of that important place. By the advice of the perfidious Raymond, the Christians were betrayed into a camp destitute of water. He fled on the first onset, with the curses of both nations. Lusignan was overthrown, with the loss of 30,000 men, and the wood of the true cross, a dire misfortune, was left in the power of the infidels. The royal captive was conducted to the tent of Saladin, and as he fainted with thirst and terror, the generous victor presented him with a cup of sherbet cooled in snow, without suffering his companion, Reginald of Chatillon, to partake of this pledge of hospitality and pardon. "The person and dignity of a king," said the Sultan, "are sacred, but this impious robber must instantly acknowledge the Prophet, whom he has blasphemed, or meet the death which he has so often deserved." On the proud or conscientious refusal of the Christian warrior, Saladin struck him on the head with his scimitar, and Reginald was dispatched by the guards. The trembling Lusinian was sent to Damascus to an honourable prison and speedy ransom, but the victory was stained by the execution of 230 knights of the hospital, the intrepid champions and martyrs of their faith. The kingdom was left without a head, and of the 2 Grand Masters of the military orders, the one was slain and the other was a prisoner. From all the cities, both of the sea-coast and the inland country, the garrisons had been drawn away for this fatal field. Tyre and Tripoli alone could escape the rapid inroad of Saladin, and 3 months after the battle of Tiberias he appeared in arms before the gates of Jerusalem. He might expect that the siege of a city so venerable on earth and in heaven, so interesting to Europe and Asia, would rekindle the last sparks of enthusiasm, and that, of 60,000 Christians, every man would be a soldier, and every soldier a candidate for martyrdom. But Queen Sibylla trembled for herself and her captive husband, and the barons and knights who had escaped from the sword and chains of the Turks displayed the same factious and selfish spirit in the public ruin. The most numerous portion of the inhabitants was composed of the Greek and Oriental Christians, whom experience had taught to prefer the Mahometan before the Latin yoke, and the Holy Sepulchre attracted a base and needy crowd without arms or courage, who subsisted only on the charity of the pilgrims. Some feeble and hasty efforts were made for the defence of Jerusalem. Within the space of 14 days a victorious army drove back the sallies of the besieged, planted their engines, opened the wall to the breadth of 15 cubits, applied their scaling ladders, and erected on the breach 12 banners of the Prophet and the Sultan. It was in vain that a barefoot procession of the Queen, the women, and the monks implored the Son of God to save his tomb and his inheritance from impious violation. Their sole hope was in the mercy of the conqueror, and to their first suppliant deputation that mercy was sternly denied. He had sworn to avenge the patience and long suffering of the Moslems. The hour of forgiveness was elapsed, and the moment was now arrived to expiate, in blood, the innocent blood which had been spilt by Godfrey and the first Crusaders. But a desperate and successful struggle of the Franks admonished the Sultan that his triumph was not yet secure. He listened with reverence to a solemn adjuration in the name of the common father of mankind, and a sentiment of human sympathy mollified the rigour of fanaticism and conquest. He consented to accept the city and to spare the inhabitants. The Greek and Oriental Christians were permitted to live under his dominion, but it was stipulated that in 40 days all the Franks and Latins should evacuate Jerusalem and be safely conducted to the seaports of Syria and Egypt, that 10 pieces of gold should be paid for each man, 5 for each woman, and 1 for every child, and that those who were unable to purchase their freedom should be detained in perpetual slavery. Of some writers it is a favourite and invidious theme to compare the humanity of Saladin with the massacre of the First Crusade. The difference would be merely personal, but we should not forget that the Christians had offered to capitulate, and that the Mahometans of Jerusalem sustained the last extremities of an assault and storm. Justice is indeed due to the fidelity with which the Turkish conqueror fulfilled the conditions of the treaty, and he may be deservedly praised for the glance of pity which he cast on the misery of the vanquished. Instead of a rigorous exaction of his debt, he accepted a sum of 30,000 byzants for the ransom of 7,000 poor. 2,000 or 3,000 more were dismissed by his gratuitous clemency, and the number of slaves was reduced to 11,000 or 14,000 persons. In this interview with the Queen, his words, and even his tears, suggested the kindest consolations. His liberal alms were distributed among those who had been made orphans or widows by the fortune of war, and while the Knights of the Hospital were in arms against him, he allowed their more pious brethren to continue, during the term of a year, the care and service of the sick. In these acts of mercy, the virtue of Saladin deserves our admiration and love. He was above the necessity of dissimulation, and his stern fanaticism would have prompted him to dissemble rather than to affect this profane compassion for the enemies of the Koran. After Jerusalem had been delivered from the presence of the strangers, the Sultan made his triumphal entry, his banners waving in the wind, and to the harmony of martial music. The great mosque of Omar, which had been converted into a church, was again consecrated to one God and his prophet Mahomet. The walls and pavement were purified with rose water, and a pulpit, the labour of Noureddin, was erected in the sanctuary. But when the golden cross that glittered on the dome was cast down and dragged through the streets, the Christians of every sect uttered a lamentable groan, which was answered by the joyful shouts of the Moslems. In 4 ivory chests the patriarch had collected the crosses, the images, the vases, and the relics of the holy place. They were seized by the conqueror, who was desirous of presenting the Caliph with the trophies of Christian idolatry. He was persuaded, however, to entrust them to the Patriarch and Prince of Antioch, and the pious pledge was redeemed by Richard of England at the expense of 52,000 byzants of gold. The nations might fear and hope the immediate and final expulsion of the Latins from Syria, which was yet delayed above a century after the death of Saladin. In the career of victory he was first checked by the resistance of Tyre. The troops and garrisons which had capitulated were imprudently conducted to the same port. Their numbers were adequate to the defence of the place, and the arrival of Conrad of Montferrat inspired the disorderly crowd with confidence and union. His father, a venerable pilgrim, had been made prisoner in the battle of Tiberias, but that disaster was unknown in Italy and Greece, where the son was urged by ambition and piety to visit the inheritance of his royal nephew, the infant Baldwin. The view of the Turkish banners warned him from the hostile coast of Jaffa, and Conrad was unanimously hailed as the prince and champion of Tyre, which was already besieged by the conqueror of Jerusalem. The firmness of his zeal, and perhaps his knowledge of a generous foe, enabled him to brave the threats of the Sultan, and to declare that should his aged parent be exposed before the walls, he himself would discharge the first arrow, and glory in his descent from a Christian martyr. The Egyptian fleet was allowed to enter the harbour of Tyre, but the chain was suddenly drawn, and 5 galleys were either sunk or taken. 1,000 Turks were slain in a sally, and Saladin, after burning his engines, concluded a glorious campaign by a disgraceful retreat to Damascus. He was soon assailed by a more formidable tempest. The pathetic narratives, and even the pictures, that represented in lively colours the servitude and profanation of Jerusalem, awakened the torpid sensibility of Europe. The Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, and the kings of France and England assumed the cross, and the tardy magnitude of their armaments was anticipated by the maritime states of the Mediterranean and the ocean. The skilful and provident Italians first embarked in the ships of Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. They were speedily followed by the most eager pilgrims of France, Normandy, and the Western Isles. The powerful succour of Flanders, Frise, and Denmark filled near 100 vessels, and the northern warriors were distinguished in the field by a lofty stature and ponderous battle-axe. Their increasing multitudes could no longer be confined within the walls of Tyre, or remain obedient to the voice of Conrad. They pitied the misfortunes, and revered the dignity, of Licinian, who was released from prison perhaps to divide the army of the Franks. He proposed the recovery of Ptolemais, or Acre, 30 miles to the south of Tyre, and the place was first invested by 2,000 horse and 30,000 foot under his nominal command. I shall not expatiate on the story of this memorable siege, which lasted near 2 years, and consumed, in a narrow space, the forces of Europe and Asia. Never did the flame of enthusiasm burn with fiercer and more destructive rage, nor could the true believers, a common appellation, who consecrated their own martyrs, refuse some applause to the mistaken zeal and courage of their adversaries. At the sound of the holy trumpet, the Moslems of Egypt, Syria, Arabia, and the Oriental provinces assembled under the servant of the Prophet. His camp was pitched and removed within a few miles of Acre, and he laboured night and day for the relief of his brethren and the annoyance of the Franks. 9 battles, not unworthy of the name, were fought in the neighbourhood of Mount Carmel, with such vicissitude of fortune that in one attack the Sultan forced his way into the city, that in one sally the Christians penetrated to the royal tent. By the means of divers and pigeons a regular correspondence was maintained with the besieged, and, as often as the sea was left open, the exhausted garrison was withdrawn and a fresh supply was poured into the place. The Latin camp was thinned by famine, the sword, and the climate, but the tents of the dead were replenished with new pilgrims who exaggerated the speed and strength of their approaching countrymen. The vulgar was astonished by the report that the Pope himself, with an innumerable crusade, was advanced as far as Constantinople. The march of the Emperor filled the East with more serious alarms. The obstacles which he encountered in Asia, and perhaps in Greece, were raised by the policy of Saladin. His joy on the death of Barbarossa was measured by his esteem, and the Christians were rather dismayed than encouraged at the sight of the Duke of Swabia and his way-worn remnant of 5,000 Germans. At length, in the spring of the second year, the royal fleets of France and England cast anchor in the Bay of Acre, and the siege was more vigorously prosecuted by the youthful emulation of the two kings, Philip Augustus and Richard Plantagenet. After every resource had been tried, and every hope was exhausted, the defenders of Acre submitted to their fate. A capitulation was granted, but their lives and liberties were taxed at the hard conditions of a ransom of 200,000 pieces of gold, the deliverance of 100 nobles and 1,500 inferior captives, and the restoration of the wood of the Holy Cross. Some doubts in the agreement, and some delay in the execution, rekindled the fury of the Franks, and 3,000 Moslems, almost in the Sultan's view, were beheaded by the command of the sanguinary Richard. By the conquest of Acre, the Latin powers acquired a strong town and a convenient harbour, but the advantage was most dearly purchased. The minister and historian of Saladin computes, from the report of the enemy, that their numbers, at different periods, amounted to 500,000 or 600,000, that more than 100,000 Christians were slain, that a far greater number was lost by disease or shipwreck, and that a small portion of this mighty host could return in safety to their native countries. End of chapter 59, part 2. Chapter 59, Part 3 of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6, by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 59, The Crusades, Part 3. Philip Augustus and Richard I are the only kings of France and England who have fought under the same banners, but the holy service in which they were enlisted was incessantly disturbed by their national jealousy, and the two factions, which they protected in Palestine, were more averse to each other than to the common enemy. In the eyes of the Orientals, the French monarch was superior in dignity and power, and in the emperor's absence the Latins revered him as their temporal chief. His exploits were not adequate to his fame. Philip was brave, but the statesman predominated in his character. He was soon weary of sacrificing his health and interest on a barren coast. The surrender of Acre became the signal of his departure, nor could he justify this unpopular desertion by leaving the Duke of Burgundy with 500 knights and 10,000 foot for the service of the Holy Land. The King of England, though inferior in dignity, surpassed his rival in wealth and military renown, and if heroism be confined to brutal and ferocious valour, Richard Plantagenet will stand high among the heroes of the age. The memory of Coeur de Lion, of the lion-hearted prince, was long dear and glorious to his English subjects, and at the distance of 60 years it was celebrated in proverbial sayings by the grandsons of the Turks and Saracens against whom he had fought. His tremendous name was employed by the Syrian mothers to silence their infants, and if a horse suddenly started from the way, his rider was wont to exclaim, "Dost thou think King Richard is in that bush?" His cruelty to the Mahometans was the effect of temper and zeal, but I cannot believe that a soldier so free and fearless in the use of his lance would have descended to whet a dagger against his valiant brother Conrad of Montferrat, who was slain at Tyre by some secret assassins. After the surrender of Acre and the departure of Philip, the King of England led the Crusaders to the recovery of the seacoast, and the cities of Caesarea and Jaffa were added to the fragments of the kingdom of Lusignan. A march of 100 miles from Acre to Ascalon was a great and perpetual battle of 11 days. In the disorder of his troops, Saladin remained on the field with 17 guards without lowering his standard, or suspending the sound of his brazen kettle-drum. He again rallied and renewed the charge, and his preachers or heralds called aloud on the Unitarians manfully to stand up against the Christian idolaters. But the progress of these idolaters was irresistible, and it was only by demolishing the walls and buildings of Ascalon that the Sultan could prevent them from occupying an important fortress on the confines of Egypt. During a severe winter the armies slept, but in the spring the Franks advanced within a day's march of Jerusalem under the leading standard of the English king, and his active spirit intercepted a convoy or caravan of 7,000 camels. Saladin had fixed his station in the Holy City, but the city was struck with consternation and discord. He fasted, he prayed, he preached, he offered to share the dangers of the siege. But his Mamelukes, who remembered the fate of their companions at Acre, pressed the Sultan with loyal or seditious clamours to reserve his person and their courage for the future defence of the religion and empire. The Moslems were delivered by the sudden, or as they deemed, the miraculous retreat of the Christians, and the laurels of Richard were blasted by the prudence or envy of his companions. The hero, ascending a hill and veiling his face, exclaimed with an indignant voice, "Those who are unwilling to rescue are unworthy to view the sepulchre of Christ." After his return to Acre, on the news that Jaffa was surprised by the Sultan, he sailed with some merchant vessels and leaped foremost on the beach. The castle was relieved by his presence, and 60,000 Turks and Saracens fled before his arms. The discovery of his weakness provoked them to return in the morning, and they found him carelessly encamped before the gates with only 17 knights and 300 archers. Without counting their numbers, he sustained their charge, and we learn from the evidence of his enemies that the King of England, grasping his lance, rode furiously along their front from the right to the left wing, without meeting an adversary who dared to encounter his career. Am I writing the history of Orlando or Amadis? During these hostilities, a languid and tedious negotiation between the Franks and Moslems was started and continued and broken and again resumed and again broken. Some acts of royal courtesy, the gift of snow and fruit, the exchange of Norway hawks and Arabian horses, softened the asperity of religious war. From the vicissitude of success, the monarchs might learn to suspect that heaven was neutral in the quarrel, nor, after the trial of each other, could either hope for a decisive victory. The health both of Richard and Saladin appeared to be in a declining state, and they respectively suffered the evils of distant and domestic warfare. Plantagenet was impatient to punish a perfidious rival who had invaded Normandy in his absence, and the indefatigable Sultan was subdued by the cries of the people, who was the victim, and of the soldiers, who were the instruments, of his martial zeal. The first demands of the King of England were the restitution of Jerusalem, Palestine, and the True Cross, and he firmly declared that himself and his brother pilgrims would end their lives in the pious labour, rather than return to Europe with ignominy and remorse. But the conscience of Saladin refused, without some weighty compensation, to restore the idols, or promote the idolatry of the Christians. He asserted, with equal firmness, his religious and civil claim to the sovereignty of Palestine, descanted on the importance and sanctity of Jerusalem, and rejected all terms of the establishment or partition of the Latins. The marriage which Richard proposed, of his sister with the Sultan's brother, was defeated by the difference of faith. The princess abhorred the embraces of a Turk, and Adel, or Saphedin, would not easily renounce a plurality of wives. A personal interview was declined by Saladin, who alleged their mutual ignorance of each other's language, and the negotiation was managed with much art and delay by their interpreters and envoys. The final agreement was equally disproved by the zealots of both parties, by the Roman pontiff and the Caliph of Baghdad. It was stipulated that Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre should be open, without tribute or vexation, to the pilgrimage of the Latin Christians; that, after the demolition of Ascalon, they should inclusively possess the sea coast from Jaffa to Tyre; that the Count of Tripoli and the Prince of Antioch should be comprised in the truce; and that, during 3 years and 3 months, all hostilities should cease. The principal chiefs of the two armies swore to the observance of the treaty, but the monarchs were satisfied with giving their word and their right hand, and the royal majesty was excused from an oath, which always implies some suspicion of falsehood and dishonour. Richard embarked for Europe to seek a long captivity and a premature grave, and the space of a few months concluded the life and glories of Saladin. The Orientals describe his edifying death, which happened at Damascus, but they seem ignorant of the equal distribution of his arms among the 3 religions, or of the display of a shroud instead of a standard to admonish the East of the instability of human greatness. The unity of empire was dissolved by his death. His sons were oppressed by the stronger arm of their uncle Saphedin. The hostile interests of the sultans of Egypt, Damascus, and Aleppo were again revived, and the Franks or Latins stood and breathed and hoped in their fortresses along the Syrian coast. The noblest monument of a conqueror's fame, and of the terror which he inspired, is the Saladine Tenth, a general tax which was imposed on the laity, and even the clergy, of the Latin Church, for the service of the Holy War. The practice was too lucrative to expire with the occasion, and this tribute became the foundation of all the tithes and tenths on ecclesiastical benefices which have been granted by Roman pontiffs to Catholic sovereigns, or reserved for the immediate use of the Apostolic See. This pecuniary emolument must have tended to increase the interest of the popes in the recovery of Palestine. After the death of Saladin, they preached the Crusade by their epistles, their legates, and their missionaries, and the accomplishment of the pious work might have been expected from the zeal and talents of Innocent III. Under that young and ambitious priest, the successors of St. Peter attained the full meridian of their greatness, and in a reign of 18 years he exercised a despotic command over the emperors and kings whom he raised and deposed, over the nations whom an interdict of months or years deprived, for the offence of their rulers, of the exercise of Christian worship. In the Council of the Lateran he acted as the ecclesiastical, almost as the temporal sovereign of the East and West. It was at the feet of his legate that John of England surrendered his crown, and Innocent may boast of the 2 most signal triumphs over sense and humanity, the establishment of transubstantiation and the origin of the Inquisition. At his voice 2 crusades, the 4th and 5th, were undertaken, but, except a king of Hungary, the princes of the 2nd order were at the head of the pilgrims, the forces were inadequate to the design, nor did the effects correspond with the hopes and wishes of the Pope and the people. The 4th Crusade was diverted from Syria to Constantinople, and the conquest of the Greek or Roman Empire by the Latins will form the proper and important subject of the next chapter. In the 5th, 200,000 Franks were landed at the eastern mouth of the Nile. They reasonably hoped that Palestine must be subdued in Egypt, the seat and storehouse of the Sultan, and, after a siege of 16 months, the Moslems deplored the loss of Damietta. But the Christian army was ruined by the pride and insolence of the legate Pelagius, who in the Pope's name assumed the character of general. The sickly popes were encompassed by the waters of the Nile and the Oriental forces, and it was by the evacuation of Damietta that they obtained a safe retreat, some concessions for the pilgrims, and the tardy restitution of the doubtful relic of the true cross. The failure may in some measure be ascribed to the abuse and multiplication of the Crusades, which were preached at the same time against the pagans of Livonia, the Moors of Spain, the Albigeois of France, and the kings of Sicily of the imperial family. In these meritorious services, the volunteers might acquire at home the same spiritual indulgence and a larger measure of temporal rewards, and even the popes, in their zeal against a domestic enemy, were sometimes tempted to forget the distress of their Syrian brethren. From the last age of the Crusades they derived the occasional command of an army and revenue, and some deep reasoners have suspected that the whole enterprise, from the first synod of Placentia, was contrived and executed by the policy of Rome. The suspicion is not founded either in nature or in fact. The successors of St. Peter appear to have followed, rather than guided, the impulse of manners and prejudice. Without much foresight of the seasons or cultivation of the soil, they gathered the ripe and spontaneous fruits of the superstition of the times. They gathered these fruits without toil or personal danger. In the Council of the Lateran, Innocent III declared an ambiguous resolution of animating the Crusaders by his example, but the pilot of the sacred vessel could not abandon the helm, nor was Palestine ever blessed with the presence of a Roman pontiff. End of chapter 59, part 3.
Chapter 60, part 1 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Schism of the Greeks and Latins. State of Constantinople. Revolt of the Bulgarians. Isaac Angelus dethroned by his brother Alexius. Origin of the Fourth Crusade. Alliance of the French and Venetians with the son of Isaac. Their naval expedition to Constantinople. The two sieges and final conquest of the city by the Latins. The restoration of the Western Empire by Charlemagne was speedily followed by the separation of the Greek and Latin churches. A religious and national animosity still divides the two largest communions of the Christian world, and the schism of Constantinople, by alienating her most useful allies and provoking her most dangerous enemies, has precipitated the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the East. In the course of the present history, the aversion of the Greeks for the Latins has been often visible and conspicuous. It was originally derived from the disdain of servitude, inflamed, after the time of Constantine, by the pride of equality or dominion, and finally exasperated by the preference which their rebellious subjects had given to the alliance of the Franks. In every age the Greeks were proud of their superiority in profane and religious knowledge. They had first received the light of Christianity. They had pronounced the decrees of the 7 general councils. They alone possessed the language of scripture and philosophy. Nor should the barbarians, immersed in the darkness of the West, presume to argue on the high and mysterious questions of theological science. Those barbarians despised in their turn the restless and subtle levity of the Orientals, the authors of every heresy, and blessed their own simplicity, which was content to hold the tradition of the Apostolic Church. Yet in the 7th century, the synods of Spain, and afterwards of France, improved or corrupted the Nicene Creed on the mysterious subject of the third person of the Trinity. In the long controversies of the East, the nature and generation of the Christ had been scrupulously defined, and the well-known relation of Father and Son seemed to convey a faint image to the human mind. The idea of birth, was less analogous to the Holy Spirit, who, instead of a divine gift or attribute, was considered by the Catholics as a substance, a person, a god. He was not begotten, but in the orthodox style he proceeded. Did he proceed from the Father alone, perhaps by the Son, or from the Father and the Son? The first of these opinions was asserted by the Greeks, the second by the Latins, and the addition to the Nicene Creed of the word filioque kindled the flame of discord between the Oriental and the Gallic churches. In the origin of the disputes, the Roman pontiffs affected a character of neutrality and moderation. They condemned the innovation, but they acquiesced in the sentiment of the Transalpine brethren. They seemed desirous of casting a veil of silence and charity over the superfluous research. And in the correspondence of Charlemagne and Leo III, the Pope assumes the liberality of a statesman, and the Prince descends to the passions and prejudices of a priest. But the orthodoxy of Rome spontaneously obeyed the impulse of the temporal policy, and the filioque, which Leo wished to erase, was transcribed in the symbol and chanted in the liturgy of the Vatican. The Nicene and Athanasian creeds are held as the Catholic faith, without which none can be saved, and both Papists and Protestants must now sustain and return the anathemas of the Greeks, who deny the procession of the Holy Ghost from the Son, as well as from the Father. Such articles of faith are not susceptible of treaty, but the rules of discipline will vary in remote and independent churches, and the reason, even of divines, might allow that the difference is inevitable and harmless. The craft or superstition of Rome has imposed on her priests and deacons the rigid obligation of celibacy. Among the Greeks it is confined to the bishops. The loss is compensated by dignity or annihilated by age, and the parochial clergy, the papas, enjoy the conjugal society of the wives whom they have married before their entrance into holy orders. A question concerning the azymes was fiercely debated in the 11th century, and the essence of the Eucharist was supposed in the East and West to depend on the use of leavened or unleavened bread. Shall I mention in a serious history the furious reproaches that were urged against the Latins, who for a long while remained on the defensive? They neglected to abstain, according to the apostolical decree, from things strangled, and from blood. They fasted, a Jewish observance, on the Saturday of each week. During the first week of Lent they permitted the use of milk and cheese. Their infirm monks were indulged in the taste of flesh, and animal grease was substituted for the want of vegetable oil. The holy chrism or unction in baptism was reserved to the episcopal order. The bishops, as the bridegrooms of their churches, were decorated with rings. Their priests shaved their faces and baptized by a single immersion. Such were the crimes which provoked the zeal of the patriarchs of Constantinople, and which were justified with equal zeal by the doctors of the Latin Church. Bigotry and national aversion are powerful magnifiers of every object of dispute. But the immediate cause of the schism of the Greeks may be traced in the emulation of the leading prelates, who maintained the supremacy of the old metropolis superior to all, and of the reigning capital inferior to none in the Christian world. About the middle of the 9th century, Photius, an ambitious layman, the captain of the guards and principal secretary, was promoted by merit and favour to the more desirable office of Patriarch of Constantinople. In science, even ecclesiastical science, he surpassed the clergy of the age, and the purity of his morals has never been impeached. But his ordination was hasty, his rise was irregular, and Ignatius, his abdicated predecessor, was yet supported by the public compassion and the obstinacy of his adherents. They appealed to the tribunal of Nicholas I., one of the proudest and most aspiring of the Roman pontiffs, who embraced the welcome opportunity of judging and condemning his rival of the East. Their quarrel was embittered by a conflict of jurisdiction over the king and nation of the Bulgarians; nor was their recent conversion to Christianity of much avail to either prelate, unless he could number the proselytes among the subjects of his power. With the aid of his court, the Greek patriarch was victorious, but in the furious contest he deposed in his turn the successor of St. Peter, and involved the Latin Church in the reproach of heresy and schism. Photius sacrificed the peace of the world to a short and precarious reign. He fell with his patron the Caesar Bardas, and Basil the Macedonian performed an act of justice in the restoration of Ignatius, whose age and dignity had not been sufficiently respected. From his monastery or prison, Photius solicited the favour of the emperor by pathetic complaints and artful flattery, and the eyes of his rival were scarcely closed when he was again restored to the throne of Constantinople. After the death of Basil, he experienced the vicissitudes of courts and the ingratitude of a royal pupil. The patriarch was again deposed, and in his last solitary hours he might regret the freedom of a secular and studious life. In each revolution, the breath, the nod of the sovereign had been accepted by a submissive clergy, and a synod of 300 bishops was always prepared to hail the triumph or to stigmatize the fall of the holy or the execrable Photius. By a delusive promise of succour or reward, the popes were tempted to countenance these various proceedings, and the synods of Constantinople were ratified by their epistles or legates. But the court and the people, Ignatius and Photius, were equally adverse to their claims. Their ministers were insulted or imprisoned. The procession of the Holy Ghost was forgotten. Bulgaria was forever annexed to the Byzantine throne, and the schism was prolonged by their rigid censure of all the multiplied ordinations of an irregular patriarch. The darkness and corruption of the 10th century suspended the intercourse without reconciling the minds of the two nations. But when the Norman sword restored the churches of Apulia to the jurisdiction of Rome, the departing flock was warned by a petulant epistle of the Greek patriarch to avoid and abhor the errors of the Latins. The rising majesty of Rome could no longer brook the insolence of a rebel, and Michael Cerularius was excommunicated in the heart of Constantinople by the Pope's legates. Shaking the dust from their feet, they deposited on the altar of St. Sophia a direful anathema, which enumerates the 7 mortal heresies of the Greeks, and devotes the guilty teachers and their unhappy sectaries to the eternal society of the devil and his angels. According to the emergencies of the church and state, a friendly correspondence was sometimes resumed. The language of charity and concord was sometimes affected. But the Greeks have never recanted their errors. The popes have never repealed their sentence, and from this thunderbolt we may date the consummation of the schism. it was enlarged by each ambitious step of the Roman pontiffs. The emperors blushed and trembled at the ignominious fate of their royal brethren of Germany, and the people were scandalized by the temporal power and military life of the Latin clergy. The aversion of the Greeks and Latins was nourished and manifested in the 3 first expeditions to the Holy Land. Alexius Comnenus contrived the absence at least of the formidable pilgrims. His successors, Manuel and Isaac Angelus, conspired with the Moslems for the ruin of the greatest princes of the Franks, and their crooked and malignant policy was seconded by the active and voluntary obedience of every order of their subjects. Of this hostile temper, a large portion may doubtless be ascribed to the difference of language, dress, and manners, which severs and alienates the nations of the globe. The pride, as well as the prudence, of the sovereign was deeply wounded by the intrusion of foreign armies, that claimed a right of traversing his dominions and passing under the walls of his capital. His subjects were insulted and plundered by the rude strangers of the West, and the hatred of the pusillanimous Greeks was sharpened by secret envy of the bold and pious enterprises of the Franks. But these profane causes of national enmity were fortified and inflamed by the venom of religious zeal. Instead of a kind embrace, a hospitable reception from their Christian brethren of the East, every tongue was taught to repeat the names of schismatic and heretic, more odious to an orthodox ear than those of pagan and infidel. Instead of being loved for the general conformity of faith and worship, they were abhorred for some rules of discipline, some questions of theology, in which themselves or their teachers might differ from the Oriental Church. In the crusade of Louis VII, the Greek clergy washed and purified the altars which had been defiled by the sacrifice of a French priest. The companions of Frederick Barbarossa deplore the injuries which they endured, both in word and deed, from the peculiar rancour of the bishops and monks. Their prayers and sermons excited the people against the impious barbarians, and the patriarch is accused of declaring that the faithful might obtain the redemption of all their sins by the extirpation of the schismatics. An enthusiast named Dorotheus alarmed the fears and restored the confidence of the emperor by a prophetic assurance that the German heretic, after assaulting the gate of Blachernes, would be made a signal example of the divine vengeance. The passage of these mighty armies were rare and perilous events, but the Crusades introduced a frequent and familiar intercourse between the two nations, which enlarged their knowledge without abating their prejudices. The wealth and luxury of Constantinople demanded the productions of every climate. These imports were balanced by the art and labour of her numerous inhabitants. Her situation invites the commerce of the world, and in every period of her existence, that commerce has been in the hands of foreigners. After the decline of Amalfi, the Venetians, Pisans, and Genoese introduced their factories and settlements into the capital of the empire. Their services were rewarded with honours and immunities. They acquired the possession of lands and houses. Their families were multiplied by marriages with the natives. And, after the toleration of a Mahometan mosque, it was impossible to interdict the churches of the Roman rite. The 2 wives of Manuel Comnenus were of the race of the Franks. The first a sister-in-law of the Emperor Conrad, the second a daughter of the Prince of Antioch. He obtained for his son Alexius a daughter of Philip Augustus, King of France. And he bestowed his own daughter on a Marquis of Montferrat, who was educated and dignified in the palace of Constantinople. The Greek encountered the arms, and aspired to the empire of the West. He esteemed the valour and trusted the fidelity of the Franks. Their military talents were unfitly recompensed by the lucrative offices of judges and treasurers. The policy of Manuel had solicited the alliance of the Pope, and the popular voice accused him of a partial bias to the nation and religion of the Latins. During his reign, and that of his successor Alexius, they were exposed at Constantinople to the reproach of foreigners, heretics, and favourites; and this triple guilt was severely expiated in the tumult which announced the return and elevation of Andronicus. The people rose in arms. From the Asiatic shore the tyrant dispatched his troops and galleys to assist the national revenge, and the hopeless resistance of the strangers served only to justify the rage and sharpen the daggers of the assassins. Neither age, nor sex, nor the ties of friendship or kindred could save the victims of national hatred and avarice and religious zeal. The Latins were slaughtered in their houses and in the streets; their quarter was reduced to ashes; the clergy were burnt in their churches, and the sick in their hospitals; and some estimate may be formed of the slain, from the clemency which sold above 4,000 Christians in perpetual slavery to the Turks. The priests and monks were the loudest and most active in the destruction of the schismatics; and they chanted a thanksgiving to the Lord when the head of a Roman cardinal, the Pope's legate, was severed from his body, fastened to the tail of a dog, and dragged with savage mockery through the city. The more diligent of the strangers had retreated, on the first alarm, to their vessels, and escaped through the Hellespont from the scene of blood. In their flight they burnt and ravaged 200 miles of the sea coast, inflicted a severe revenge on the guiltless subjects of the empire, marked the priests and monks as their peculiar enemies, and compensated, by the accumulation of plunder, the loss of their property and friends. On their return they exposed to Italy and Europe the wealth and weakness, the perfidy and malice of the Greeks, whose vices were painted as the genuine characters of heresy and schism. The scruples of the first Crusaders had neglected the fairest opportunities of securing, by the possession of Constantinople, the way to the Holy Land. Domestic revolution invited, and almost compelled, the French and Venetians to achieve the conquest of the Roman Empire of the East. In the series of the Byzantine princes, I have exhibited the hypocrisy and ambition, the tyranny and fall of Andronicus, the last male of the Comnenian family who reigned at Constantinople. The revolution, which cast him headlong from the throne, saved and exalted Isaac Angelus, who descended by the females from the same imperial dynasty. The successor of a second Nero might have found it an easy task to deserve the esteem and affection of his subjects. They sometimes had reason to regret the administration of Andronicus. The sound and vigorous mind of the tyrant was capable of discerning the connection between his own and the public interest; and while he was feared by all who could inspire him with fear, the unsuspected people and the remote provinces might bless the inexorable justice of their master. But his successor was vain and jealous of the supreme power, which he wanted courage and abilities to exercise. His vices were pernicious, His virtues, if he possessed any virtues, were useless to mankind, and the Greeks, who imputed their calamities to his negligence, denied him the merit of any transient or accidental benefits of the times. Isaac slept on the throne, and was awakened only by the sound of pleasure. His vacant hours were amused by comedians and buffoons, and even to these buffoons the emperor was an object of contempt. His feasts and buildings exceeded the examples of royal luxury. The number of his eunuchs and domestics amounted to 20,000, and a daily sum of 4,000 pounds of silver would swell to 4 millions sterling the annual expense of his household and table. His poverty was relieved by oppression, and the public discontent was inflamed by equal abuses in the collection and the application of the revenue. While the Greeks numbered the days of their servitude, a flattering prophet, whom he rewarded with the dignity of patriarch, assured him of a long and victorious reign of 32 years, during which he should extend his sway to Mount Libanus, and his conquests beyond the Euphrates. But his only step towards the accomplishment of the prediction was a splendid and scandalous embassy to Saladin, to demand the restitution of the Holy Sepulchre, and to propose an offensive and defensive league with the enemy of the Christian name. In these unworthy hands of Isaac and his brother, the remains of the Greek empire crumbled into dust. The island of Cyprus, whose name excites the ideas of elegance and pleasure, was usurped by his namesake, a Comnenian prince, and by a strange concatenation of events, the sword of our English Richard bestowed that kingdom on the house of Lusignan, a rich compensation for the loss of Jerusalem. The honour of the monarchy and the safety of the capital were deeply wounded by the revolt of the Bulgarians and Wallachians. Since the victory of the second Basil, they had supported, above 170 years, the loose dominion of the Byzantine princes; but no effectual measures had been adopted to impose the yoke of laws and manners on these savage tribes. By the command of Isaac, their sole means of subsistence, their flocks and herds, were driven away, to contribute towards the pomp of the royal nuptials, and their fierce warriors were exasperated by the denial of equal rank and pay in the military service. Peter and Asan, two powerful chiefs of the race of the ancient kings, asserted their own rights and the national freedom. The demoniac impostors proclaimed to the crowd that their glorious patron, Saint Demetrius, had for ever deserted the cause of the Greeks; and the conflagration spread from the banks of the Danube to the hills of Macedonia and Thrace. After some faint efforts, Isaac Angelus and his brother acquiesced in their independence, and the imperial troops were soon discouraged by the bones of their fellow soldiers, that were scattered along the passes of Mount Haemus. By the arms and policy of John or Joannices, the second kingdom of Bulgaria was firmly established. The subtle barbarian sent an embassy to Innocent III to acknowledge himself a genuine son of Rome in descent and religion, and humbly received from the Pope the license of coining money, the royal title, and a Latin archbishop or patriarch. The Vatican exulted in the spiritual conquest of Bulgaria, the first object of the schism; and if the Greeks could have preserved the prerogatives of the Church, they would gladly have resigned the rights of the monarchy. The Bulgarians were malicious enough to pray for the long life of Isaac Angelus, the surest pledge of their freedom and prosperity. Yet their chiefs could involve in the same indiscriminate contempt the family and nation of the emperor. "In all the Greeks," said Asan to his troops, "the same climate and character and education will be productive of the same fruits. Behold my lance," continued the warrior, "and the long streamers that float in the wind. They differ only in colour. They are formed of the same silk, and fashioned by the same workmen, nor has the stripe that is stained in purple any superior price or value above its fellows." Several of these candidates for the purple successively rose and fell under the empire of Isaac. A general who had repelled the fleets of Sicily was driven to revolt and ruin by the ingratitude of the prince; and his luxurious repose was disturbed by secret conspiracies and popular insurrections. The emperor was saved by accident, or the merit of his servants. He was at length oppressed by an ambitious brother, who, for the hope of a precarious diadem, forgot the obligations of nature, of loyalty, and of friendship. While Isaac in the Thracian valleys pursued the idle and solitary pleasures of the chase, his brother Alexius Angelus was invested with the purple, by the unanimous suffrage of the camp. The capital and the clergy subscribed their choice, and the vanity of the new sovereign rejected the name of his fathers for the lofty and royal appellation of the Comnenian race. On the despicable character of Isaac I have exhausted the language of contempt, and can only add, that in a reign of 8 years the baser Alexius was supported by the masculine vices of his wife Euphrosyne. The first intelligence of his fall was conveyed to the late emperor by the hostile aspect and pursuit of the guards, no longer his own. He fled before them above 50 miles, as far as Stagyra in Macedonia; but the fugitive, without an object or a follower, was arrested, brought back to Constantinople, deprived of his eyes, and confined in a lonesome tower on a scanty allowance of bread and water. At the moment of the revolution, his son Alexius, whom he educated in the hope of empire, was 12 years of age. He was spared by the usurper, and reduced to attend his triumph both in peace and war. But as the army was encamped on the seashore, an Italian vessel facilitated the escape of the royal youth, and, in the disguise of a common sailor, he eluded the search of his enemies, passed the Hellespont, and found a secure refuge in the Isle of Sicily. After saluting the threshold of the apostles, and imploring the protection of Pope Innocent III, Alexius accepted the kind invitation of his sister Irene, the wife of Philip of Swabia, king of the Romans. But in his passage through Italy, he heard that the flower of Western chivalry was assembled at Venice for the deliverance of the Holy Land, and a ray of hope was kindled in his bosom, that their invincible swords might be employed in his father's restoration. About 10 or 12 years after the loss of Jerusalem, the nobles of France were again summoned to the holy war by the voice of a third prophet, less extravagant, perhaps, than Peter the Hermit, but far below Saint Bernard in the merit of an orator and a statesman. An illiterate priest of the neighbourhood of Paris, Fulk of Neuilly, forsook his parochial duty to assume the more flattering character of a popular and itinerant missionary. The fame of his sanctity and miracles was spread over the land. He declaimed with severity and vehemence against the vices of the age, and his sermons, which he preached in the streets of Paris, converted the robbers, the usurers, the prostitutes, and even the doctors and scholars of the university. No sooner did Innocent III ascend the chair of St. Peter than he proclaimed in Italy, Germany, and France the obligation of a new crusade. The eloquent pontiff described the ruin of Jerusalem, the triumph of the pagans, and the shame of Christendom. His liberality proposed the redemption of sins, a plenary indulgence to all who should serve in Palestine, either a year in person, or 2 years by a substitute; and among his legates and orators who blew the sacred trumpet, Fulk of Neuilly was the loudest and most successful. The situation of the principal monarchs was averse to the pious summons. The Emperor Frederick II was a child, and his kingdom of Germany was disputed by the rival houses of Brunswick and Swabia, the memorable factions of the Guelphs and Ghibellines. Philip Augustus of France had performed, and could not be persuaded to renew, the perilous vow. But as he was not less ambitious of praise than of power, he cheerfully instituted a perpetual fund for the defence of the Holy Land. Richard of England was satiated with the glory and misfortunes of his first adventure, and he presumed to deride the exhortations of Fulk of Neuilly, who was not abashed in the presence of kings. "You advise me," said Plantagenet, "to dismiss my 3 daughters, pride, avarice, and incontinence. I bequeath them to the most deserving: my pride to the Knights Templars, my avarice to the monks of Cisteaux, and my incontinence to the prelates." But the preacher was heard and obeyed by the great vassals, the princes of the second order, and Theobald or Thibault, Count of Champagne, was the foremost in the holy race. The valiant youth, at the age of 22 years, was encouraged by the domestic examples of his father, who marched in the second crusade, and of his elder brother, who had ended his days in Palestine with the title of King of Jerusalem. 2,200 knights owed service and homage to his peerage. The nobles of Champagne excelled in all the exercises of war, and by his marriage with the heiress of Navarre, Thibault could draw a band of hardy Gascons from either side of the Pyrenean mountains. His companion in arms was Louis, Count of Blois and Chartres, like himself of regal lineage, for both the princes were nephews, at the same time, of the kings of France and England. In a crowd of prelates and barons who imitated their zeal, I distinguish the birth and merit of Matthew of Montmorency, the famous Simon of Montfort, the scourge of the Albigeois, and a valiant noble, Geoffrey of Villehardouin, Marshal of Champagne, who has condescended, in the rude idiom of his age and country, to write or dictate an original narrative of the counsels and actions in which he bore a memorable part. At the same time, Baldwin, Count of Flanders, who had married the sister of Thibault, assumed the cross at Bruges with his brother Henry, and the principal knights and citizens of that rich and industrious province. The vow which the chiefs had pronounced in churches, they ratified in tournaments. The operations of the war were debated in full and frequent assemblies, and it was resolved to seek the deliverance of Palestine in Egypt, a country, since Saladin's death, which was almost ruined by famine and civil war. But the fate of so many royal armies displayed the toils and perils of a land expedition, and if the Flemings dwelt along the ocean, the French barons were destitute of ships and ignorant of navigation. They embraced the wise resolution of choosing 6 deputies or representatives, of whom Villehardouin was one, with a discretionary trust to direct the motions and to pledge the faith of the whole confederacy. The maritime states of Italy were alone possessed of the means of transporting the holy warriors with their arms and horses, and the 6 deputies proceeded to Venice to solicit, on motives of piety or interest, the aid of that powerful republic. In the invasion of Italy by Attila, I have mentioned the flight of the Venetians from the fallen cities of the continent, and their obscure shelter in the chain of islands that lie in the extremity of the Adriatic Gulf. In the midst of the waters, free, indigent, laborious, and inaccessible, they gradually coalesced into a republic. The first foundations of Venice were laid in the island of Rialto, and the annual election of the 12 tribunes was superseded by the permanent office of a duke or doge. On the verge of the 2 empires, the Venetians exult in the belief of primitive and perpetual independence. Against the Latins their antique freedom has been asserted by the sword, and may be justified by the pen. Charlemagne himself resigned all claims of sovereignty to the islands of the Adriatic Gulf. His son Pepin was repulsed in the attacks of the lagunas or canals, too deep for the cavalry, and too shallow for the vessels. And in every age, under the German Caesars, the lands of the Republic have been clearly distinguished from the kingdom of Italy. But the inhabitants of Venice were considered by themselves, by strangers, and by their sovereigns, as an inalienable portion of the Greek empire. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the proofs of their subjection are numerous and unquestionable; and the vain titles, the servile honours of the Byzantine court, so ambitiously solicited by their dukes, would have degraded the magistrates of a free people. But the bands of this dependence, which was never absolute or rigid, were imperceptibly relaxed by the ambition of Venice and the weakness of Constantinople. Obedience was softened into respect, privilege ripened into prerogative, and the freedom of domestic government was fortified by the independence of foreign dominion. The maritime cities of Istria and Dalmatia bowed to the sovereigns of the Adriatic; and when they armed against the Normans in the cause of Alexius, the emperor applied not to the duty of his subjects, but to the gratitude and generosity of his faithful allies. The sea was their patrimony. The western parts of the Mediterranean, from Tuscany to Gibraltar, were indeed abandoned to their rivals of Pisa and Genoa; but the Venetians acquired an early and lucrative share of the commerce of Greece and Egypt. Their riches increased with the increasing demand of Europe; their manufactures of silk and glass, perhaps the institution of their bank, are of high antiquity; and they enjoyed the fruits of their industry in the magnificence of public and private life. To assert her flag, to avenge her injuries, to protect the freedom of navigation, the Republic could launch and man a fleet of 100 galleys; and the Greeks, the Saracens, and the Normans were encountered by her naval arms. The Franks of Syria were assisted by the Venetians in the reduction of the sea coast; but their zeal was neither blind nor disinterested; and in the conquest of Tyre they shared the sovereignty of a city, the first seat of the commerce of the world. The policy of Venice was marked by the avarice of a trading, and the insolence of a maritime power. Yet her ambition was prudent, nor did she often forget that if armed galleys were the effect and safeguard, merchant vessels were the cause and supply of her greatness. In her religion she avoided the schisms of the Greeks, without yielding a servile obedience to the Roman pontiff; and a free intercourse with the infidels of every clime appears to have allayed betimes the fever of superstition. Her primitive government was a loose mixture of democracy and monarchy. The doge was elected by the votes of the General Assembly. As long as he was popular and successful, he reigned with the pomp and authority of a prince, but in the frequent revolutions of the state he was deposed or banished or slain by the justice or injustice of the multitude. The 12th century produced the first rudiments of the wise and jealous aristocracy, which has reduced the doge to a pageant and the people to a cipher. End of chapter 60, part 1 of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Two of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Chapter 60. The Fourth Crusade, Part 2. When the 6 ambassadors of the French pilgrims arrived at Venice, they were hospitably entertained in the palace of St. Mark by the reigning duke. His name was Henry Dandolo, and he shone in the last period of human life as one of the most illustrious characters of the times. Under the weight of years, and after the loss of his eyes, Dandolo retained a sound understanding and a manly courage, the spirit of a hero ambitious to signalise his reign by some memorable exploits, and the wisdom of a patriot anxious to build his fame on the glory and advantage of his country. He praised the bold enthusiasm and liberal confidence of the barons and their deputies. In such a cause, and with such associates, he should aspire, were he a private man, to terminate his life. But he was the servant of the Republic, and some delay was requisite to consult, on this arduous business, the judgment of his colleagues. The proposal of the French was first debated by the 6 sages who had been recently appointed to control the administration of the Doge. It was next disclosed to the 40 members of the Council of State, and finally communicated to the Legislative Assembly of 450 representatives, who were annually chosen in the 6 quarters of the city. In peace and war, the Doge was still the chief of the Republic. His legal authority was supported by the personal reputation of Dandolo. His arguments of public interest were balanced and approved, and he was authorized to inform the ambassadors of the following conditions of the treaty. It was proposed that the Crusaders should assemble at Venice on the feast of St. John of the ensuing year, that flat-bottomed vessels should be prepared for 4,500 horses and 9,000 squires, with a number of ships sufficient for the embarkation of 4,500 knights and 20,000 foot; that during a term of 9 months they should be supplied with provisions, and transported to whatsoever coast the service of God and Christendom should require; and that the Republic should join the armament with a squadron of 50 galleys. It was required that the pilgrims should pay, before their departure, a sum of 85,000 marks of silver, and that all conquests, by sea and land, should be equally divided between the confederates. The terms were hard, but the emergency was pressing, and the French barons were not less profuse of money than of blood. A general assembly was convened to ratify the treaty. The stately chapel and place of St. Mark were filled with 10,000 citizens, and the noble deputies were taught a new lesson of humbling themselves before the majesty of the people. "Illustrious Venetians," said the Marshal of Champagne, "we are sent by the greatest and most powerful barons of France to implore the aid of the masters of the sea for the deliverance of Jerusalem. They have enjoined us to fall prostrate at your feet, nor will we rise from the ground till you have promised to avenge with us the injuries of Christ." The eloquence of their words and tears, Their martial aspect and suppliant attitude were applauded by a universal shout, as it were, says Geoffrey, by the sound of an earthquake. The venerable Doge ascended the pulpit to urge their request by those motives of honour and virtue which alone can be offered to a popular assembly. The treaty was transcribed on parchment, attested with oaths and seals, mutually accepted by the weeping and joyful representatives of France and Venice, and despatched to Rome for the approbation of Pope Innocent III. 2,000 marks were borrowed of the merchants for the first expenses of the armament. Of the 6 deputies, 2 repassed the Alps to announce their success, while their 4 companions made a fruitless trial of the zeal and emulation of the republics of Genoa and Pisa. The execution of the treaty was still opposed by unforeseen difficulties and delays. The marshal, on his return to Troyes, was embraced and approved by Thibault, Count of Champagne, who had been unanimously chosen general of the confederates. But the health of that valiant youth already declined, and soon became hopeless, and he deplored the untimely fate which condemned him to expire, not in a field of battle, but on a bed of sickness. To his brave and numerous vassals the dying prince distributed his treasures. They swore in his presence to accomplish his vow and their own, but some there were, says the marshal, who accepted his gifts and forfeited their words. The more resolute champions of the cross held a parliament at Soissons for the election of a new general, but such was the incapacity, or jealousy, or reluctance of the princes of France, that none could be found both able and willing to assume the conduct of the enterprise. They acquiesced in the choice of a stranger, of Boniface, Marquis of Montferrat, descended of a race of heroes, and himself of conspicuous fame in the wars and negotiations of the times. Nor could the piety or ambition of the Italian chief decline this honourable invitation. After visiting the French court, where he was received as a friend and kinsman, the Marquis, in the church of Soissons, was invested with the cross of a pilgrim and the staff of a general, and immediately repassed the Alps to prepare for the distant expedition of the East. About the festival of the Pentecost he displayed his banner and marched towards Venice at the head of the Italians. He was preceded or followed by the counts of Flanders and Blois, and the most respectable barons of France, and their numbers were swelled by the pilgrims of Germany, whose object and motives were similar to their own. The Venetians had fulfilled and even surpassed their engagements. Stables were constructed for the horses, and barracks for the troops. The magazines were abundantly replenished with forage and provisions, and the fleet of transports, ships, and galleys was ready to hoist sail as soon as the Republic had received the price of the freight and armament. But that price far exceeded the wealth of the Crusaders who were assembled at Venice. The Flemings, whose obedience to their count was voluntary and precarious, had embarked in their vessels for the long navigation of the ocean and Mediterranean, and many of the French and Italians had preferred a cheaper and more convenient passage from Marseilles and Apulia to the Holy Land. Each pilgrim might complain that after he had furnished his own contribution, he was made responsible for the deficiency of his absent brethren. The gold and silver plate of the chiefs, which they freely delivered to the treasury of St. Mark's, was a generous but inadequate sacrifice, and after all their efforts 34,000 marks were still wanting to complete the stipulated sum. The obstacle was removed by the policy and patriotism of the Doge, who proposed to the barons that if they would join their arms in reducing some revolted cities of Dalmatia, he would expose his person in the holy war, and obtain from the Republic a long indulgence till some wealthy conquest should afford the means of satisfying the debt. After much scruple and hesitation, they chose rather to accept the offer than to relinquish the enterprise, and the first hostilities of the fleet and army were directed against Zara, a strong city of the Sclavonian coast, which had renounced its allegiance to Venice, and implored the protection of the king of Hungary. The Crusaders burst the chain or boom of the harbor, landed their horses, troops, and military engines, and compelled the inhabitants, after a defence of 5 days, to surrender at discretion. Their lives were spared, but the revolt was punished by the pillage of their houses and the demolition of their walls. The season was far advanced. The French and Venetians resolved to pass the winter in a secure harbor and plentiful country, but their repose was disturbed by national and tumultuous quarrels of the soldiers and mariners. The conquest of Zara had scattered the seeds of discord and scandal. The arms of the allies had been stained in their outset with the blood, not of infidels, but of Christians. The king of Hungary and his new subjects were themselves enlisted under the banner of the cross, and the scruples of the devout were magnified by the fear of lassitude of the reluctant pilgrims. The Pope had excommunicated the false crusaders who had pillaged and massacred their brethren, and only the Marquis Boniface and Simon of Montfort escaped these spiritual thunders, the one by his absence from the siege, the other by his final departure from the camp. Innocent might absolve the simple and submissive penitents of France, but he was provoked by the stubborn reason of the Venetians, who refused to confess their guilt, to accept their pardon, or to allow, in their temporal concerns, the interposition of a priest. The assembly of such formidable powers by sea and land had revived the hopes of young Alexius, and both at Venice and Zara he solicited the arms of the Crusaders for his own restoration and his father's deliverance. The royal youth was recommended by Philip, king of Germany. His prayers and presence excited the compassion of the camp, and his cause was embraced and pleaded by the Marquis of Montferrat and the Doge of Venice. A double alliance and the dignity of Caesar had connected with the imperial family the 2 elder brothers of Boniface. He expected to derive a kingdom from the important service, and the more generous ambition of Dandolo was eager to secure the inestimable benefits of trade and dominion that might accrue to his country. Their influence procured a favourable audience for the ambassadors of Alexius, and if the magnitude of his offers excited some suspicion, the motives and rewards which he displayed might justify the delay and diversion of those forces which had been consecrated to the deliverance of Jerusalem. He promised in his own and his father's name, that as soon as they should be seated on the throne of Constantinople, they would terminate the long schism of the Greeks, and submit themselves and their people to the lawful supremacy of the Roman Church. He engaged to recompense the labours and merits of the Crusaders by the immediate payment of 200,000 marks of silver, to accompany them in person to Egypt, or, if it should be judged more advantageous, to maintain during a year 10,000 men, and during his life 500 knights, for the service of the Holy Land. These tempting conditions were accepted by the Republic of Venice, and the eloquence of the Doge and Marquis persuaded the Counts of Flanders, Blois, and St. Pol, with 8 barons of France, to join in the glorious enterprise. A treaty of offensive and defensive alliance was confirmed by their oaths and seals, and each individual, according to his situation and character, was swayed by the hope of public or private advantage, by the honour of restoring an exiled monarch, or by the sincere and probable opinion that their efforts in Palestine would be fruitless and unavailing, and that the acquisition of Constantinople must precede and prepare the recovery of Jerusalem. But they were the chiefs or equals of a valiant band of freemen and volunteers who thought and acted for themselves. The soldiers and clergy were divided, and if a large majority subscribed to the alliance, the numbers and arguments of the dissidents were strong and respectable. The boldest hearts were appalled by the report of the naval power and impregnable strength of Constantinople; and their apprehensions were disguised to the world, and perhaps to themselves, by the more decent objections of religion and duty. They alleged the sanctity of a vow which had drawn them from their families and homes to the rescue of the Holy Sepulchre; nor should the dark and crooked counsels of human policy divert them from a pursuit, the event of which was in the hands of the Almighty. Their first offence, the attack of Zara, had been severely punished by the reproach of their conscience and the censures of the Pope; nor would they again imbrue their hands in the blood of their fellow Christians. The Apostle of Rome had pronounced, nor would they usurp the right of avenging with the sword the schism of the Greeks and the doubtful usurpation of the Byzantine monarch. On these principles or pretences, many pilgrims, the most distinguished for their valour and piety, withdrew from the camp; and their retreat was less pernicious than the open or secret opposition of a discontented party, that laboured, on every occasion, to separate the army and disappoint the enterprise. Notwithstanding this defection, the departure of the fleet and army was vigorously pressed by the Venetians, whose zeal for the service of the royal youth concealed a just resentment to his nation and family. They were mortified by the recent preference which had been given to Pisa, the rival of their trade. They had a long arrear of debt and injury to liquidate with the Byzantine court, and Dandolo might not discourage the popular tale that he had been deprived of his eyes by the Emperor Manuel, who perfidiously violated the sanctity of an ambassador. A similar armament for ages had not rowed the Adriatic. It was composed of 120 flat-bottomed vessels or palanders for the horses, 240 transports filled with men and arms, 70 store ships laden with provisions, and 50 stout galleys, well prepared for the encounter of an enemy. While the wind was favourable, the sky serene, and the water smooth, every eye was fixed with wonder and delight on the scene of military and naval pomp which overspread the sea. The shields of the knights and squires, at once an ornament and a defence, were arranged on either side of the ships. The banners of the nations and families were displayed from the stern. Our modern artillery was supplied by 300 engines for casting stones and darts. The fatigues of the way were cheered with the sound of music, and the spirits of the adventurers were raised by the mutual assurance that 40,000 Christian heroes were equal to the conquest of the world. In the navigation from Venice and Zara, the fleet was successfully steered by the skill and experience of the Venetian pilots. At Durazzo, the confederates first landed on the territories of the Greek empire. The Isle of Corfu afforded a station and repose. They doubled, without accident, the perilous Cape of Malea, the southern point of Peloponnesus, or the Morea, made a descent in the islands of Negropont and Andros, and cast anchor at Abydos on the Asiatic side of the Hellespont. These preludes of conquest were easy and bloodless. The Greeks of the provinces, without patriotism or courage, were crushed by an irresistible force. The presence of the lawful heir might justify their obedience, and it was rewarded by the modesty and discipline of the Latins. As they penetrated through the Hellespont, the magnitude of their navy was compressed in a narrow channel, and the face of the waters was darkened with innumerable sails. They again expanded in the basin of the Propontis, and traversed that placid sea, till they approached the European shore at the Abbey of St. Stephen, 3 leagues to the west of Constantinople. The prudent Doge dissuaded them from dispersing themselves in a populous and hostile land; and, as their stock of provisions was reduced, it was resolved, in the season of harvest, to replenish their storeships in the fertile islands of the Propontis. With this resolution they directed their course; but a strong gale, and their own impatience, drove them to the eastward, and so near did they run to the shore and the city, that some volleys of stones and darts were exchanged between the ships and the rampart. As they passed along, they gazed with admiration on the capital of the East, or, as it should seem, of the earth, rising from her 7 hills and towering over the continents of Europe and Asia. The swelling domes and lofty spires of 500 palaces and churches were gilded by the sun and reflected in the waters. The walls were crowded with soldiers and spectators, whose numbers they beheld, of whose temper they were ignorant, and each heart was chilled by the reflection that, since the beginning of the world, such an enterprise had never been undertaken by such a handful of warriors. But the momentary apprehension was dispelled by hope and valour, and every man, says the Marshal of Champagne, glanced his eye on the sword or lance which he must speedily use in the glorious conflict. The Latins cast anchor before Chalcedon, the mariners only were left in the vessels, the soldiers, horses, and arms were safely landed, and in the luxury of an imperial palace the barons tasted the first fruits of their success. On the 3rd day the fleet and army moved towards Scutari, the Asiatic suburb of Constantinople. A detachment of 500 Greek horse was surprised and defeated by 80 French knights, and in a halt of 9 days their camp was plentifully supplied with forage and provisions. In relating the invasion of a great empire, it may seem strange that I have not described the obstacles which should have checked the progress of the strangers. The Greeks, in truth, were an unwarlike people, but they were rich, industrious, and subject to the will of a single man. Had that man been capable of fear when his enemies were at a distance, or of courage when they approached his person? The first rumour of his nephew's alliance with the French and Venetians was despised by the usurper Alexius. His flatterers persuaded him that in this contempt he was bold and sincere, and each evening in the close of the banquet he thrice discomfited the barbarians of the West. These barbarians had been justly terrified by the report of his naval power, and the 1600 fishing boats of Constantinople could have manned a fleet to sink them in the Adriatic, or stop their entrance in the mouth of the Hellespont. But all force may be annihilated by the negligence of the prince and the venality of his ministers. The great duke or admiral made a scandalous, almost a public, auction of the sails, the masts, and the rigging. The royal forests were reserved for the more important purpose of the chase, and the trees, says Nicetas, were guarded by the eunuchs like the groves of religious worship. From his dream of pride, Alexius was awakened by the siege of Zara, and the rapid advances of the Latins. As soon as he saw the danger was real, he thought it inevitable, and his vain presumption was lost in abject despondency and despair. He suffered these contemptible barbarians to pitch their camp in the sight of the palace, and his apprehensions were thinly disguised by the pomp and menace of a suppliant embassy. The sovereign of the Romans was astonished, his ambassadors were instructed to say, at the hostile appearance of the strangers. If these pilgrims were sincere in their vow for the deliverance of Jerusalem, his voice must applaud, and his treasures should assist, their pious design. But should they dare to invade the sanctuary of empire, their numbers, were they 10 times more considerable, should not protect them from his just resentment. The answer of the Doge and barons was simple and magnanimous. "In the cause of honour and justice," they said, "we despise the usurper of Greece, his threats and his offers. Our friendship and his allegiance are due to the lawful heir, to the young prince who is seated among us, and to his father, the Emperor Isaac, who has been deprived of his sceptre, his freedom, and his eyes by the crime of an ungrateful brother. Let that brother confess his guilt and implore forgiveness, and we ourselves will intercede that he may be permitted to live in affluence and security. But let him not insult us by a second message. Our reply will be made in arms in the palace of Constantinople." On the 10th day of their encampment at Scutari, the Crusaders prepared themselves, as soldiers and as Catholics, for the passage of the Bosphorus. Perilous indeed was the adventure. The stream was broad and rapid. In a calm the current of the Euxine might drive down the liquid and unextinguishable fires of the Greeks, and the opposite shores of Europe were defended by 70,000 horse and foot in formidable array. On this memorable day, which happened to be bright and pleasant, the Latins were distributed in 6 battles or divisions. The first or vanguard was led by the Count of Flanders, one of the most powerful of the Christian princes in the skill and number of his crossbows. The 4 successive battles of the French were commanded by his brother Henry. The Counts of St. Paul and Blois and Matthew of Montmorency, the last of whom was honoured by the voluntary service of the marshal and nobles of Champagne. The 6th division, the rear guard and reserve of the army, was conducted by the Marquis of Montferrat at the head of the Germans and Lombards. The chargers, saddled with their long caparisons dragged on the ground, were embarked in the flat palanders, and the knights stood by the side of their horses, in complete armour, their helmets laced, and their lances in their hands. The numerous train of sergeants and archers occupied the transports, and each transport was towed by the strength and swiftness of a galley. The 6 divisions traversed the Bosphorus without encountering an enemy or an obstacle. To land the foremost was the wish, to conquer or die was the resolution, of every division and of every soldier. Jealous of the preeminence of danger, the knights in their heavy armour leaped into the sea when it rose as high as their girdle. The sergeants and archers were animated by their valour, and the squires, letting down the drawbridges of the palanders, led the horses to the shore. Before their squadrons could mount, and form, and couch their lances, the 70,000 Greeks had vanished from their sight. The timid Alexius gave the example to his troops, and it was only by the plunder of his rich pavilions that the Latins were informed that they had fought against an emperor. In the first consternation of the flying enemy, they resolved by a double attack to open the entrance of the harbour. The tower of Galata, in the suburb of Pera, was attacked and stormed by the French, while the Venetians assumed the more difficult task of forcing the boom or chain that was stretched from that tower to the Byzantine shore. After some fruitless attempts, their intrepid perseverance prevailed. 20 ships of war, the relics of the Grecian navy, were either sunk or taken. The enormous and massy links of iron were cut asunder by the shears, or broken by the weight, of the galleys, and the Venetian fleet, safe and triumphant, rode at anchor in the port of Constantinople. By these daring achievements, a remnant of 20,000 Latins solicited the license of besieging a capital which contained above 400,000 inhabitants, able, though not willing, to bear arms in defence of their country. Such an account would indeed suppose a population of near 2 millions. But whatever abatement may be required in the numbers of the Greeks, the belief of those numbers will equally exalt the fearless spirit of their assailants. In the choice of the attack, the French and Venetians were divided by their habits of life and warfare. The former affirmed with truth that Constantinople was most accessible on the side of the sea and the harbour. The latter might assert with honour that they had long enough trusted their lives and fortunes to a frail bark, and a precarious element, and loudly demanded a trial of knighthood, a firm ground, and a close onset, either on foot or on horseback. After a prudent compromise of employing the two nations by sea and land in the service best suited to their character, the fleet covering the army, they both proceeded from the entrance to the extremity of the harbour. The stone bridge of the river was hastily repaired, and the 6 battles of the French formed their encampment against the front of the capital, the basis of the triangle which runs about 4 miles from the port to the Propontis. On the edge of a broad ditch, at the foot of a lofty rampart, they had leisure to contemplate the difficulties of their enterprise. The gates to the right and left of their narrow camp poured forth frequent sallies of cavalry and light infantry, which cut off their stragglers, swept the country of provisions, sounded the alarm 5 or 6 times in the course of each day, and compelled them to plant a palisade and sink an entrenchment for their immediate safety. In the supplies and convoys, the Venetians had been too sparing, or the Franks too voracious. The usual complaints of hunger and scarcity were heard, and perhaps felt their stock of flour would be exhausted in 3 weeks; and their disgust of salt meat tempted them to taste the flesh of their horses. The trembling usurper was supported by Theodore Lascaris, his son-in-law, a valiant youth who aspired to save and to rule his country. The Greeks, regardless of that country, were awakened to the defence of their religion; but their firmest hope was in the strength and spirit of the Varangian guards, of the Danes and English, as they are named in the writers of the times. After 10 days' incessant labour, the ground was levelled, the ditch filled, the approaches of the besiegers were regularly made, and 250 engines of assault exercised their various powers to clear the rampart, to batter the walls, and to sap the foundations. On the first appearance of a breach, the scaling ladders were applied. The numbers that defended the vantage ground repulsed and oppressed the adventurous Latins; but they had marred the resolution of 15 knights and sergeants who had gained the ascent and maintained their perilous station till they were precipitated or made prisoners by the imperial guards. On the side of the harbour, the naval attack was more successfully conducted by the Venetians, and that industrious people employed every resource that was known and practised before the invention of gunpowder. A double line, 3 bow shots in front, was formed by the galleys and ships, and the swift motion of the former was supported by the weight and loftiness of the latter, whose decks and poops and turret were the platforms of military engines that discharged their shot over the heads of the first line. The soldiers, who leaped from the galleys on shore, immediately planted and ascended their scaling ladders, while the large ships, advancing more slowly into the intervals, and lowering a drawbridge, opened a way through the air from their masts to the rampart. In the midst of the conflict, the Doge, a venerable and conspicuous form, stood aloft in complete armour on the prow of his galley. The great standard of St. Mark was displayed before him. His threats, promises, and exhortations urged the diligence of the rowers. His vessel was the first that struck, and Dandolo was the first warrior on the shore. The nations admired the magnanimity of the blind old man, without reflecting that his age and infirmities diminished the price of life, and enhanced the value of immortal glory. On a sudden, by an invisible hand, for the standard bearer was probably slain, the banner of the Republic was fixed on the rampart. 25 towers were rapidly occupied, and by the cruel expedient of fire, the Greeks were driven from the adjacent quarter. The Doge had despatched the intelligence of his success, when he was checked by the danger of his confederates. Nobly declaring that he would rather die with the pilgrims than gain a victory by their destruction, Dandolo relinquished his advantage, recalled his troops, and hastened to the scene of action. He found the 6 weary diminutive battles of the French encompassed by 60 squadrons of the Greek cavalry, the least of which was more numerous than the largest of their divisions. Shame and despair had provoked Alexius to the last effort of a general sally; but he was awed by the firm order and manly aspect of the Latins, and, after skirmishing at a distance, withdrew his troops in the close of the evening. The silence or tumult of the night exasperated his fears; and the timid usurper, collecting a treasure of 10,000 pounds of gold, basely deserted his wife, his people, and his fortune, threw himself into a bark, stole through the Bosphorus, and landed in shameful safety in an obscure harbour of Thrace. As soon as they were apprised of his flight, the Greek nobles sought pardon and peace in the dungeon where the blind Isaac expected each hour the visit of the executioner. Again saved and exalted by the vicissitudes of fortune, the captive in his imperial robes was replaced on the throne, and surrounded with prostrate slaves, whose real terror and affected joy he was incapable of discerning. At the dawn of day, hostilities were suspended, and the Latin chiefs were surprised by a message from the lawful and reigning emperor, who was impatient to embrace his son, and to reward his generous deliverers. End of Chapter 60. Part 2.